eso, ¿eh? of the thought, which is capable of being a common property of many. And Fraga gave his particularly and perhaps suspiciously well-chosen example of the Pythagorean theorem. The area of the square on the hypotenuse is equal to the areas of the sums of the squares on the other two sides. Fraga's idea is that this is an example where the thought or the proposition expressed by that sentence here, the proposition expressed by that sentence is what is passed from generation to generation. It's not a sentence or a particular thought, since current and prior mathematicians had different minds and they spoke and wrote and thought in different scientific dialects of different languages. But maybe a more straightforward way of seeing the difference between the traditional and the abstract notion would be to look at sentences 1 and 2. So here we have El mundo es redondo and the world is round. 1 and 2 represent two propositions in the traditional sense, but only one proposition in the abstract sense described here. And I will be concerned with Church's argument for the existence of propositions in the abstract sense only. And an important aspect of Church's argument is an old dialogue due to Leibniz, which Church credits with making an important step towards establishing the need for the notion of proposition. And as reported by Church, the dialogue can be presented as Roman numerals 1 through 6. So I've sort of tried to break it up into an argument to make it a little bit more explicit when there are assumptions in a dialogue. You know, with a dialogue, sometimes assumptions are granted by both participants in the dialogue, and that way the author of the dialogue can sort of smuggle something past you. So I just want to break this up into an argument. So premise 1 is a supposition for a reductio ad absurdum. Premise 1 says that the bearers of truth and falsehood are either actual particular thoughts or judgments, or the things. So that's what we're going to show to be false by o reductio. And the second premise, this is simply an assumption, is that what is thought or judged by no one may nevertheless be true. So I suppose intuitively there are truths of geometry that were true before they were entertained or judged by any human being. Now it follows from 2 that actual particular thoughts or judgments are not the bearers of truth. And then by 1 and 3, we get that the things are the bearers of truth. But it's asserted in the dialogue, things are not the bearers of falsehood, right? This pen cannot be false. And then it follows from 4 and 5 that we cannot say that the same logical subject is the bearer of both truth and falsehood. And that, I think, is might be a reductio of 1. But there are some assumptions going on here. I will show you the argument again in a moment, so don't worry if it disappears. So assumption 2, first of all, or what is thought or judged by no one may nevertheless be true. This seems plausible. I just said that there are truths of geometry whose truth does not depend on their being entertained or considered. But Church is a very judicious, cautious philosopher, so he discusses whether we might deny assumption 2. And here the idea would be that truth and falsehood do attach only to actual particular thoughts or acts of judgment or sentences that are expressed by human beings. And against this, Church argues that we would then be limited to those thoughts that we could actually think or say in a reasonable amount of time. And this is a huge problem for mathematics, because then there would no longer be a distinction between the statement like this. So this, I've chosen a number that is much, much, much larger than the largest known prime number. That's already a very, very large number. And so this statement, the largest prime number dividing that 2 to the 2 to the 4, etc., equals m, that statement is unproved because of human limitations, right? So proving that would require enormous amount of number theory, the substantial use of computers that would have to run for longer than, many, many times the length of the known universe. So that's a claim in number theory that's unproved because of human limitations. But there's a distinction between statements like that and statements such as the Gödel sentence, which are unprovable as a matter of mathematical necessity, right? Any mathematical statement that's been shown to be independent of the axioms of a theory, in which one would hope to prove it, is unprovable as a matter of mathematical necessity. And we want to draw a distinction between those kinds of sentences and ones like this that are simply unprovable because of human and physical limitations. Now, this is a rather highfalutin sort of example, but obviously our inability to concretely embody and carry out certain kinds of computations is of enormous practical importance, right? This is what protects our bank accounts from hackers. And it's obviously a topic that is studied both in concrete terms in computer science for the reasons I just gave, but also in more abstract terms. So consider there's a very simple system of arithmetic called Presburger Arithmetic. Presburger was a very interesting character. He was a student of Tarski's, Alfred Tarski's, who formulated this simple kind of arithmetic and proved that it was decidable. There's an algorithm with which you can decide the truth value of any statement of Presburger arithmetic. He was killed in the Holocaust, so he never did any work after his master's degree. So Presburger arithmetic is the theory of the natural numbers with a successor relation and addition, but crucially, there is no multiplication, and that's very important. And now, an effective axiomatization of a theory is one where there's an algorithm that can run through all the sentences of the theory and tell you, is the sentence an axiom? If it's not an axiom, does it follow from an axiom by a rule of inference? And if it does, is it the last member of a sequence that follows from axioms by a rule of inference, in which case it's a theorem. That's what it is for an axiomatization to be effective. And an important student of Church's, Michael Rubin, showed in joint work that for every effective axiomatization of Presburger arithmetic, there is a theorem whose shortest proof is so long that it can only be discovered by a computation that we cannot concretely embody and carry out. Now, obviously, things like this are not a part of mathematics, so I've written, in case anyone's interested, what I hope and believe is a proper statement of Rubin and Fisher's theorem. So for every effective axiomatization of Presburger arithmetic, this is true, this whole thing embedded here. But that doesn't really matter. The philosophical point is that this is a hard scientific result that draws a distinction between a theorem whose shortest proof cannot be discovered by a computation that we can embody and carry out, and a theorem whose shortest proof can be so discovered. And it just seems ridiculous to me, and I know at least one member of the audience, and hopefully most of them, it seems ridiculous to me for philosophers to ignore distinctions like this in computer science simply because they're disturbed by idealization and want to restrict attention to thoughts that we can actually think or say in a reasonable amount of time. So I think that this kind of work is a very compelling sort of scientific, if you think of philosophy as embedded in other activities, so if you do normative philosophy, it should be connected to life. If you do philosophy of mathematics or science or epistemology, your philosophy should be connected to science. And if you take that attitude as I do, then considerations like this seem indecisive. So that's a reason to say that we should not cling to the view that truth and falsehood only attach to actual particular thoughts. Now, I did mention that assumptions can be smuggled into dialogues, and there's one that I didn't quite manage to make explicit in my rendering of the argument, and it's the following. The dialogue appears to assume that there's some thing, whether it's a thought or another kind of thing, a res in the medieval sense, but there's something that is the logical subject of attributions of truth and falsehood, as well as it would also be a logical object of attributions of assertion and belief. So there is something that is either true or false. Can we resist this assumption? Well, certainly philosophers have tried to back in the bad old days of nominalism. And Church was extremely critical of people like Nelson Goodman, who resisted this without providing a detailed analysis of their own. But someone very influenced by Goodman who did try to provide such an analysis was Israel Scheffler. And according to him, the logical subject of truth, as well as the logical object of assertion and belief, is not a singular term that might denote a proposition or a thought or some other kind of entity, right? But a general term that is applied to concrete inscriptions. So, for example, the world is round is true would be analyzed by Scheffler as the earth is round inscription is true. So, as it were, the subject of truth is somehow this general predicate or property of inscriptions. And likewise, Columbus asserted that the earth is round would be analyzed as Columbus asserted that the earth is round type inscription. And since that kind of what seems to me rather wacky, crazy view was the sort of thing that was proposed back then, Church did Scheffler the service of submitting his view to extensive criticism. I'm not going to spend so much time on it here, but I will make a couple of remarks. I would say the theory is obviously implausible. It seems to predict that the destruction of all concrete inscriptions or tokens would void Columbus's assertion or would render it false, but I don't think that that's the case. And maybe more dispositively, I don't see how this could account for the truth of Columbus and Herodotus, who contradicted each other. So from Columbus and Herodotus to contradict one another, there has to be something that Columbus asserted and Herodotus denied, namely that the earth is round, and that's referred to by a singular term. So I think that the sort of tacit assumption about a logical form in this argument, that there is something that is the logical subject of truth and falsehood, is probably a good one. So with that said, let me just recap the argument again. So we have the bearers of truth and falsehood are either actual particular thoughts or judgments, or they're things. What is thought or judged by no one may nevertheless be true. I've argued for that. Actual particular thoughts or judgments are not the bearers of truth. Again, that follows from 2. So then it would follow that things are the bearers of truth. But I maintain, and Church and Leibniz maintain, things are not the bearers of falsehood. And then it would follow that we cannot say that the same logical subject is the bearer of both truth and falsehood. And that's a reductio of 1. And I've also defended the idea that there is a logical subject that is the bearer of truth and falsehood. That's what I just talked about. Right. So let's pause briefly and talk about Leibniz's solution as Church describes it, which is, I think, extremely promising. And it is the view that possible thoughts are the bearers of truth and falsehood. And this is what Church considered an important step towards the abstract notion of proposition. But Church wants to go beyond this Leibnizian conclusion from the notion of a possible thought to the notion of an abstract proposition. Now, why would we do this? So Church attributes probably the rediscovery of the idea of a proposition to both Bolzano and Fraga. There's some discussion about whether the Stoics had it and whether the medievals had it. That's a bit above goes beyond my scholarly knowledge, which is pretty poor of those, especially the medievals. I'm going to steer clear of that. So just looking at Bolzano and Fraga, Church doesn't seem to endorse Bolzano's arguments so much as his conclusion that there are abstract propositions. I would ask people, there's an excellent entry on Bolzano, is a really remarkable figure, and there's a very good entry on him in the Stanford Encyclopedia that explains his many philosophical and mathematical innovations and the relationships between them. Having looked at the discussion of his argument for propositions, I would suggest the reason that Church didn't endorse it is because the argument is not sound at all. But I'd be very interested, if people are interested in Bolzano, I'd like to hear what you think about that. And if you've never read him, just have a look at his arguments on the Encyclopedia. I would love to hear from you. But moving on to Fraga, who I know much more about, Church simply reiterates Fraga's remarks about the objectivity and mind and language independence and publicity of what Fraga called Gedanken, or thoughts, which are the closest thing there is in his theorizing to a proposition. But Fraga never really tells us why possible thoughts are not also objective, mind and language independent, abstract, and public, right? So we have this great example of the Pythagorean theorem. It's passed from culture to culture and generation to generation. It's the shared content that is expressed by people in different languages, but and grasped by different minds. But it doesn't say why it couldn't be a possible thought rather than a proposition in the abstract sense. And so I'm just going to raise an issue now, which I will come back to. To me, the issue is whether possible thoughts depend on the existence of minds, right? So Frege is very clear that he thinks that Gedanken are mind and language independent. And it seems that propositions such as that 2 and 2 are 4 do not depend on the existence of minds, because intuitively they would be true if there were no human minds at all. And this mind independence, in my view, is not a mysterious sort of deep phenomenon. It simply follows from their abstractness, and abstractness isn't a mysterious phenomenon either. So in my view, abstract entities are distinguished by what they do not have, right? Being abstract is like a negative quality. So they don't have physical properties like mass. They don't have spatiotemporal properties. They don't have modal properties. They don't take tense and so on. And this explains why the following claims I would suggest are solecisms or nonsense. They're not merely false, but there's something sort of ungrammatical about them. So one claim which I would maintain is nonsense is that 2 and 2 are 4 in Mexico, but are not in the Amazon. That 2 and 2 are 4 was false before there were human minds, and that 2 and 2 are 4 would be false if there were no human minds. And so further, because these claims are nonsense, it follows that 2 and 2 are 4 is independent of human minds in the ordinary sense of independent of, which is to say that it's objective. And so just in case people are interested, so I believe that according to the ordinary sense of independent of, we start with our judgments about sentences like these And if we judge these to be false and ungrammatical, then the phenomenon in question is mind independent. So if you wanted to resist this, what a philosopher could do is somehow argue for another notion of independence, like somehow if we make something up or if we create something, then it's not mind independent, it's mind dependent. But that would be you'd have to then give an argument that that notion of independence should replace the more common sense one that I am appealing to, which simply appeals to our judgments about sentences like this. So I'm going to return to this issue at the end, because I think this offers some kind of a clue to an answer to the whole problem that I'm talking about. But at this point, I'd like to recap so we know where we are. So I've given the Leibnizian argument. I've defended its assumption that truth and falsity don't attach to actual particular thoughts or sentences. I've defended its assumption about a logical form, and I've argued that we can't rest with the conclusion that truth and falsehood attach to merely possible thoughts. And I gave the beginning of a reason to postulate abstract objective propositions instead. And I've just tried to explain why abstractness and objectivity, well, objectivity or mind independence follows from abstractness, and neither it nor abstractness are deep or mysterious at all. The point is made very nicely in Alberto Coffer's great book on the history of analytic philosophy, from Kant to Carnap. It was a great discovery. I think Fraga didn't even realize this. It was a great discovery of early 20th century analytic philosophy, that meaning could be real and exist without existing anywhere. It doesn't have to have a location. And so that's why Fraga may have missed that, was his sort of extreme realism, where he talks about propositions existing in a third realm that is neither mental nor physical. And as I say, I think the situation may be much less mysterious. Other than that, it's simply that meaning is abstract, which is to say there are certain things that are not true of it, and that abstractness explains why it's objective. Okay, so far I think things are looking quite promising. Leibniz has given us a good argument. But there's another very important moving piece in Church's argument for the existence of propositions, and he notes that instead of making the further step from possible thoughts to propositions, we might instead claim that truth and falsehood attach to sentences, or better, possible sentences of a language, those sentences that the syntactic rules of the language allow as well-formed expressions. And so Church makes a couple of observations about this claim. One of them is just, I think, obviously true, and the other one requires a lot of defense. The first one, which I won't say much about, is that, okay, so suppose we take sentences to be the logical subjects of truth and falsity. This won't help the nominalist like Scheffler or Goodman, who denies propositions because they're abstract, since possible sentences are also abstract. That's obvious to logicians, because there are infinitely many of them. So I don't think that needs much defense, but what does need a lot of defense is the following claim, which is that even if we abandon the goals of nominalism, as thank goodness people did, or at least most people did in the late 20th century eventually, but we might continue to limit our ontology to sentences anyway. Then, Church argues, nevertheless, our semantic theory will still provide a false analysis, in this case of attributions of assertion and belief. And this is a claim that requires a lot of defense. And this brings us to Church's notorious translation argument, which I will discuss for most of the rest of the session, and then I will sum up and offer my own sort of opinion. Okay, and so this translation argument is a crucial part of Church's broader argument that we need propositions to have a theory of language that's both true and humanly understandable. So consider the sentences like 1 and 2 in blue at the bottom of the page. Skepticism about the existence of propositions motivates the view that claims like 1 and 2 express relations between people and sentence types, where sentence types or possible sentences are assumed to be somehow less philosophically worrying than propositions. And Carnap is a famous advocate of such a view. So according to Carnap, Columbus believed that the world is round should be analyzed as 3, which is Columbus was disposed to an affirmative response to the English sentence, the world is round. And this is presumed to be true in virtue of the fact that Columbus is disposed to say the world is round in English, or el mundo es redondo in Spanish, or a synonymous sentence of any other language. He doesn't have to be an English speaker. And this is the view, the analysis of 2 in terms of 3 that Church deployed his translation argument against. And the argument seems to show that if we limit our ontology to sentence types, then our semantic theory will not be able to provide a good, true analysis of sentences like 2. And so I think it's certainly correct that the argument shows this much. All right. So Church's first version of the argument is translate 2 and 3 into German, making sure that, among other things, that the world is round as it occurs in 2 is translated as das die Welt rund ist, whereas the world is round as it occurs in 3 is translated into German as the world is round, because it's a quotation. Notice that the sentence, the world is round, in quotes, is mentioned in 3, whereas it is used in 2. And moreover, 3 doesn't mention the German sentence, die Welt rund ist, only the English sentence, the world is round. And so a meaning-preserving translation of 2 will have to mention the former and not the latter. So with that said, the meaning-preserving translations of 2 and 3 are 4 and 5. So 2 and 3 are at the top of your screen, and 4 and 5 are at the bottom. And Church now makes the following observation. 4 and 5 aren't synonymous, since they convey different information to a German speaker who speaks no English. And Church concluded that, therefore, 2 and 3 are not synonymous either. So now, what's going on in this argument? Let me make it explicit for you. Okay, so 4 and 5 aren't synonymous because a German speaker who speaks no English can understand 4, but not 5. And that means that 2 and 3 are not synonymous either. What's going on here? So Church is assuming that synonymy is an equivalence relation. That means it's reflexive, symmetric, and transitive. So reflexive means that P is synonymous with itself. Symmetric, if P is synonymous with Q, then Q is synonymous with P. There's a symmetry there. And finally, transitive. If P is synonymous with Q and Q is synonymous with R, then P is synonymous with R. So I think those all seem correct. So it's correct that strict synonymy is an equivalence relation. So now what's the structure of the argument? I think it's this. So again, you have the examples in blue and the argument above it in black. The claims that are controversial are in bold. So we assume that 2 and 3 are synonymous. It would follow that 4 and 5 are synonymous, but 4 and 5 aren't synonymous. So by the equivalence relation, neither are 2 and 3. And therefore, since 2 and 3 aren't synonymous, 3 cannot serve as an analysis of 2. So that's what's going on in the translational version. Now, crucially, so at the time, there was a lot of pushback against Church in virtue of his appeal to the notion of translation. So people objected, look, a translation that doesn't need to preserve meaning. The example of El mundo es redondo and the world is round is an idealized example where, yes, you can translate exactly from one into the other. But in fact, translation doesn't work like that. And somehow you just have to be the point of the argument. But it was simply a tool to try and show people what was going on. And the main point isn't that translation is needed and the detour through 4 and 5 is needed, but rather to show that 2 and 3 aren't synonymous. All you need to make is the following observation, which is embedded in the middle of your page here. Church says, it is not possible to infer 2 as a consequence of 3 on logical grounds alone. Rather, you also need to make use of an item of factual information that is not contained in 3. Namely, that the earth is round means in English that the earth is round. So Church's point is that it's only a contingent fact about the English language that 6 is true. The world is round means in English that the world is round. And Church says that this version of the argument is designed to dispel any remnants of an illusion that there is something in some way necessary or transparent about the connection between a word or sentence and its meaning, whereas, of course, this connection is entirely artificial and arbitrary. And the point is this extra information about the sort of contingent artificial conventions of English is precisely what is needed to infer 2 from 3. And so Church himself describes this version of the argument as expressing the main point he's trying to make. He says in a letter to Carnap, the main point is that 3 is inadequate as an analysis of 2 because 3 conveys less information than 2 does. I've given you 3 and 2 there again. Of course, the information that's contained in 2 but isn't in 3 is 6, namely that the world is round, means in English that the world is round. And so suppose you wonder, what did Columbus believe? And if someone says 3, he was disposed to an affirmative answer in response to the world is round. Well, if you don't know what the world is round means, then you don't know what Columbus believed. And this way of putting the argument has been discovered independently by a couple of other people later on. So here's a nice way of putting what Church calls the main point. This is due to Stephen Schiffer. I'm going to paraphrase it here. Schiffer uses a different example. To paraphrase Schiffer, no one can know that Columbus believed that the world is round without knowing what Columbus believed, the content of his belief. But someone who is a monolingual speaker of German can know that Columbus was disposed to an affirmative response to the English sentence, the world is round, without having any idea of what Columbus believed, the content of his belief. And Kripke also deployed a very similar argument a long time ago against Donald Davidson. who has a view a tiny bit like Carnap's. And Kripke very typically managed to get rid of any mention to speakers of English or German at all and just boil it down to a problem with one ambiguous sentence in one language. This is very typical of Kripke. He's very good at sort of condensing the problem down to its bare essentials. So to paraphrase again, an English speaker can know that Columbus was disposed to an affirmative response to the English sentence, visiting relatives can be tiresome, without knowing what Columbus believed, the content of his belief. Right? He might have believed that visiting relatives can be tiresome people, or he might have believed that the activity of visiting relatives can be tiresome. So Kripke's point is that the English speaker needs to know which proposition Columbus had in mind when he gave an affirmative response to the English sentence, visiting relatives can be tiresome. Okay, so that's removed appeal to translation and synonymy. But there's still a question about how to individuate the English language, or if you present this in Spanish, the Spanish language, right, any natural language. It was Church's view that the word English means something like, as he put it back then, the language that was current in the United States, Canada, and Great Britain in 1949 AD. And the point of this is that Church wants to allow that English is an evolving system rather than a fixed system. It's a system of conventions agreed upon by a population that can slowly evolve over time. And if that's right, it seems clear that the information given by 6 is conveyed in 2, but not contained in 3. That's exactly what Schiffer is saying. So the argument is now drastically simplified. Again, the examples are in blue at the bottom. 2 contains information that is not contained in 3. Therefore, 2 is neither synonymous nor even logically equivalent with 3. And therefore, 3 cannot serve as an analysis of 2. And I think that's a much stronger argument. The premises and the inferences are much weaker. And he gets the same conclusion, so that's good. And translation was simply a device to make the point vivid, which turned out to confuse people because, of course, if you use a device to try and convince philosophers of something, they can then jump on it as a source of resistance because they're always not looking to change their minds, but to resist changing their minds at all costs, right? So you need arguments to bring in as little as possible in order to give someone who you're trying to persuade less room to deploy sophisticated philosophical tricks or sophistry or something like that. But Carnap responded that English as he intended means something like the unique language having such and such semantic rules. So Carnap sort of thought of English as a logician would, or as the close correspondent of a formal language in which you simply lay down a body of rules and identify the language with those rules. And this challenges Church's claim that there's an item of factual information not contained in 3 that's needed to infer 2 from 3. You see, because so Church is saying 2 can't be an analysis, 3 can't be an analysis of 2 because there's information that's missing from 3 and you can't infer 2 from 3. Therefore, they're not logically equivalent and 3 can't be an analysis of 2. Carnap is responding, well, yes, because if you really understand the word English, then you understand all the rules of English. And one of those rules will be 6. So the point is that if English is defined to be the unique language with such and such semantic rules, and 6 is one of those rules, then it looks as though 2 would be a logical consequence of 3 if it's understood in that way. Because someone who understands the word English as it occurs in 3 thereby knows 6, which is enough to infer 2 from 3. And if that's not an example of a philosopher deploying his skills to avoid accepting a conclusion he doesn't want to accept, I don't know, or what is. So Church had already recognized that this was a problem. And he says, right towards the end of his paper against Carnap, the objection would then be less immediate that 2 is not a logical consequence of 3, and it's possible that it would disappear. But in the last paragraph, he briefly states a couple of arguments that he obviously views as cementing the falsehood of Carnap's analysis, even if English is taken to be the language with such and such fixed semantical rules. So his first point is that if Carnap's proposal is discussed in Spanish rather than English, then it'll be a totally different theory, right? Because this version of Carnap's argument contains the word English, and the sense of the word English, according to Carnap, is a body of rules of English, including 6. Whereas if you simply rephrase the whole thing in Spanish, then here it would contain the word Spanish. And that would be a whole bunch of different rules mapping Spanish symbols to meanings. And therefore, 3 and its translation in Spanish would have different meanings. And this seems very odd. And what Church is bothered about here is it seems that your analysis of 2 should be language independent, right? It doesn't matter, your theory of 2 should not vary with the language in which you're speaking as a philosopher. That seems exactly right. Next, Church observes that even if 3 entails 2, a person might not be able to see the entailment and so not draw the inference from 3 to 2. So they could believe 3 but not believe 2. And Church thinks this is a problem. Now, Church's assumption, his assumption here appears to be that if 3 were a correct analysis of 2, then understanding and believing 3 should entail understanding and believing 2. And that commits him to a narrow, that's a very strong claim about the correct form of a solution to the paradox of analysis. So many philosophers would say that one can give a correct analysis of a target sentence while believing but yet one could believe the analysandum without believing the analysands. So, for example, one could give an analysis of a sentence containing the word knowledge in terms of justified true belief plus something else. And the fact that someone could believe that John knows the P without believing John has justified true belief plus something else, the P, doesn't refute the correctness of the analysis. Finally, Church is, another point here. If 6 assigns a sense or some kind of other abstract subjective meaning to the world is round, as Carnap certainly believed it did, then he seems to have smuggled something like propositions into his analysis after all, at least propositions in the traditional sense where you have the words and their meanings. That's something else that's worth bearing in mind. Now, finally, Church is explicit in his correspondence with Carnap that any correct analysis of 2 must posit some means of naming a proposition without the intermediation of semantical ideas, and in particular, without naming or referring to a sentence that expresses the proposition. So it has to, a correct attribution of belief, an analysis of attributions of belief, has to be of the form A, R, P, where P is a way of directly naming the thing you believe without characterizing as the meaning of, quote, P. And this is what's captured in Kripke and Schiffer's way of putting the point, right? No one can know that Columbus believed that the world is round without knowing what Columbus believed. Now, Russell famously pointed out that such sort of knowledge, knowing who or what someone or something is, he called this knowledge by acquaintance and contrasted it with knowledge by description, knowledge of an entity as the entity that satisfies a description, for example, the meaning of P. So clearly this idea that an analysis of belief must posit a direct relationship to propositions is crucial to Church's point, but it's also desperately in need of theoretical development. So I'm going to come back to that very quickly. But first of all, let me just summarize Church's argument. Okay, so I've been defending claim one. So claim one of Church's argument is that propositions are entailed by any true and humanly understandable semantic theory. So that's what my Leibnizian argument was about, my refinements of the Leibnizian argument. You also have to have the argument about assertion and belief. And all that is supposed to make the case for premise one. Now, the second premise is Church's criterion of ontological commitment, as philosophers like to say. That just means his criteria for what exists, right? According to Church, if entities of a kind K are entailed or required by a true theory, then there exist entities of kind K. And then it follows from 1 and 2 that there exist propositions. Now, we started a little late. Am I just allowed to have a couple more minutes, please?
I think we can.
Okay, thank you. So I will skip over most of the topics for further work. There are many. Of course, people would want to know about his theory of ontological commitment. But let me just focus on something that will allow me to amend my conclusion, which is point 6. So recently, philosophers like Tyler Burge and Scott Soames have argued that so-called propositions are really types of mental states or types of processes, types of mental activities that are abstracted from those states, processes, and activities. So you can sort of think of the so-called propositions have a more sort of Aristotelian flavor to them. They're abstracted from actual minds rather than being sort of transcendental in the way I described them earlier. Now, in my view, this account of content is sufficiently language independent to meet Church's argument about belief. I'd have to show that, but I'm convinced, having read a lot of Burge, that he has a sketchy theory that has some means of naming a proposition and saying what Columbus believes without the intermediation of semantic descriptions. And furthermore, I think the Church has avoided appealing to a mysterious acquaintance relation. But the problem is that the account seems to make propositions dependent on the existence of minds, right? Because so on this view, propositions are classificatory devices that you need to do scientific psychology, which are abstracted from mental states. So we need to use types of mental states and processes to do psychology. And we abstract those from actual minds. But then, of course, so-called propositions are dependent on the existence of minds. And I've argued that that's bad. Now, so this just leads me to a modified Leibnizian solution to all this, and then I'll stop. So remember that Leibniz's way out, as reported by Church, is that possible thoughts are the bearers of truth and falsehood. Suppose that possible thoughts are abstracted from the notion of a possible mind, where a possible mind is capable of both accuracy and error, and so of thinking something true as well as something false. So it would seem that could do the work of being the solution to Leibniz's puzzle. We saw that propositions such that 2 and 2 are 4 do not depend on the existence of minds, since intuitively they would be true if there were no minds, right? But if the possible thought that 2 and 2 are 4 depends on the existence of possible minds, not merely on actual minds, then it can exist and be true in a situation or state of the world in which there are no minds, so long as a mind thinking that thought is possible in that state of the world, which is to say, that state of the world is accessible from another world in which a mind is thinking that thought. So my thought is that maybe possible thoughts can serve as propositions. And if I can defend that, I mean, this is so obvious that I suspect that someone else, I mean, I would have hoped a Leibniz scholar, one of the great Leibniz scholars, would have thought of this already if Leibniz didn't himself. And so I was thinking of developing this claim that propositions are really possible thoughts. Leibniz was almost right, where this is abstracted from a possible mind, then possible thoughts are still mind independent, so long as minds are possible. And then I'm going to use that to go back and take some aspects of the Burge-Soames view, not all of it. So the proposition, these possible thoughts won't be abstracted from actual minds. They'll be abstracted from possible minds. And then we can make some retraction on this mysterious issue of what is a direct relation to a possible thought. I don't need to simply say there are propositions and we have some kind of acquaintance with them. I think some theoretical traction and progress will be possible. So this idea of possible minds, this is very much, I'm very much a fan of the idea that as philosophers of language, as opposed to linguists, we don't just study English, we study the space of all possible languages. And in particular, we want to say why English is our actual language and why Spanish is our actual language. Right? And likewise, I think that philosophers of mind should not just study the mental processes of actual human beings in the way that philosophers do, but rather they should study the space of possible minds. Right? And this is something that's a view that's emerging in physics. There's a remarkable paper in Quanta by the chair of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, who is called Contemplating the End of Physics, in which he argues that we've only done a tiny bit of the physics we can ever do. We've only done the bit where we hypothesize the physical objects and processes that are actually evident in the world that explain things like Brownian motion and so forth. Right? But there are all these other possible physical theories that we can discover by simply deriving them and then building objects that implement those theories. And so we've really only done a tiny bit of physics. And likewise, I believe that by studying Spanish or English and only studying actual mental processes, we've only done a fraction of mind and language. And so I want my notion of a proposition to reflect this idea that we study mind itself or possible minds or something like that. And I'm done. Thank you very, very much for your attention.
Now we have a Q&A session. So if you have some question or comment, just raise your hand.
Before we start, Ricardo, you're in charge of ratting out your fellow students and telling me who did and didn't show up. I have 4 so far, including you. Questions, please.
It seems that all was clear.
So do you want me to pick the questions, or are you going to moderate?
Yeah. Can you see the hands, Ricardo? Because we have 4 so far. No, you cannot.
Sorry, I didn't.
I'm sorry. It's
Ricardo Mena.
Ricardo Mena, yeah, exactly. And the Raimundo. Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks. Hi, Oliver. Thanks for.
Hey, how are you?
All right, thank you. Thanks. So I have a couple of questions. So the first one has to do with the end of the talk and this notion of possible thought. If I understood correctly, you want possible thoughts to be mind independent, but I think I'll need more information to understand what you mean there, because if you talk about possible thoughts, the first thing that comes to mind, because I'm thinking about possibility in the standard way, is, well, thoughts that exist in some other possible world. And then I think, well, for sure, in that other possible world, there's a mind that is having that thought. And then whenever there's a possible thought in a possible world, there's a mind that is having that thought, then I'm not quite sure I understand in what sense possible thoughts are mind independent.
So the key thing was, it has to be that it's not that there needs to be a mind thinking a thought in the actual world. It's that there just has to be an accessible world. That's as far as I've got with this. It'll be about accessibility.
Right, but so let's say there's a thought that doesn't exist in this world, but exists in another. But in that world, there has to be a mind, right?
No, I think that there has to be an accessible world in which there's a mind.
All right, so there can be a thought in one world such that there's no mind in that world that is thinking that thought, so long as there is an accessible world with a mind. All right. Oh. But the thought exists.
Remember, I'm not a metaphysician, so for me, this is not spooky or that weird, right? This is just us talking about the way reality might have been.
But I'm not a metaphysician earlier, but just to make sure I understand. So, does this thought exist in this world or only in the accessible world?
No, it exists in this world.
All right, so it's not a merely possible thought. It's an actual thought that is being thought by a possible mind.
But remember, when we say actual, I'm not talking. The key thing is that actual is not constrained by our limitations, right? You're obviously right to push me about this because I need to work this out as like a piece of a logical exercise, which I haven't done.
All right.
So you're absolutely right to be asking these questions. And I'm not going to have answers to all of them, but yeah, the idea that it's a merely possible thought means I'm not constrained with only theorems that we can actually calculate the truth values using an embodied physical computation or things we can actually say, because I want to do justice to classical mathematics, which goes way beyond what things that we can actually say, and even more mundane computability theory clearly draws distinctions between theorems that we could say and theorems that we can't say, right? That was what the thing about Presburger was about. So I want them to be possible in the sense that they don't have to be something we could actually produce. And in my sense, they exist. In my low-key sense of abstract objects, very mundane thing, they exist. But it has to be that there's an accessible world where a mind could think that thought. Yes, look, I just sort of put that on the end as an extra because that's what I'm going to start working on. And this is very good. Clearly it's going to need like a detailed theory of what's accessible for what and why is that plausible? What are the problems that are going to be problems, right? So,
thanks.
Yeah.
Do I have time to ask another question, or maybe I should wait?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
All right. So it's a thank you. It's a question about like the basis So I haven't thought about this problem in a while, actually. I thought about it when I was an undergrad and I was reading Frege, and I remember Frege saying what you told us in this talk, that Pythagoras' theorem has always been true even before any minds thought about it. But I always had the doubt, and I'm sure I'm wrong about this. I just want you to tell me why. So why it's not enough to say, look, it has always been a mathematical, the theorem has always been a mathematical fact. It has always been a mathematical fact that this and that and that. But why do we need to say that it has always been true? Why isn't the fact, the mathematical fact, enough to explain whatever we want to explain?
Good, that's an interesting issue, actually. So, of course, for Frege, a fact is a proposition that's true, right? There are no facts over and above. Propositions, just a quick, so for Frege, a meaning is a mode of presentation, right? A way of grasping the thing you're referring to. A sentence expresses a thought, which is a complex meaning made up of the meanings expressed by the words. And a thought is an aspect or perspective on the whole truth, right? So as well, think of the whole truth as everything there is, right? Each true thought is a mode of presentation of the truth, an aspect of the truth. And it almost falls out of that immediately that a thought denotes, or a sentence denotes a truth value. Right? So for Frege, we have truth and falsehood as two, and of course, if you accept that piece of metaphysics, then if you're a mathematician, it's just like falling off a log to say there are two objects, truth and falsehood, and sentences are names of objects in the way that the name Oliver is a name of me, right? And then, of course, there's the slingshot argument that sentences can't denote propositions or facts, because if they would, all true sentences would denote one fact, and all false sentences would denote the same thing as well. So that was given by Church and Gödel, and there's a version of it by Davidson. Quine has a good version. So interestingly, actually also, so neither Frege nor Church nor Leibniz has any truck with the correspondence theory of truth or theories of facts. So these are all views on which truth is a property of propositions.
Yeah, I have a follow-up, but I've taken too much time. Maybe I can contact you and
sure.
Continue the discussion. Well, thank you.
Next, we have Modera.
Thank you, Oliver. That was very thought-provoking, of course. No pun intended. It looks like we're not going to be able to make a run parallel to correspond physically possible minds to their thought contents, to the propositions, but I don't see any reason in principle why logically possible minds might not correspond, in the sense that we can have enough of them to correspond to all the possible thoughts. But even if their possible existence can be made to run parallel, still we have the question, and I would like to know your opinion about whether we can theoretically uncouple them. They're certainly different. They can be distinguished. They should be distinguished. But we will need to have some principal reason to deny their independence, even if they can always be put in this correspondence. Both of them are abstract enough. That doesn't mean that the fact that they might accompany each other can be separated from the fact that they can exist independently of each other. So to be parallel and corresponding doesn't show us any interesting metaphysical dependence on one from the other. So what about keeping our ontology as simple as possible, to have our entities as independent as we can, since we're no longer worried about causality or any interaction, and just say, yes, I have all these logically possible minds, not physically, but at least logically, and I have all these logically possible thoughts, and they have these correspondences enough to have enough of one and corresponding to the other, and yet keep the ontological independence, have a clean separation of them, and have at the ontological level the kind of autonomy that the conceptual existence has. What are your thoughts about it?
So I would. Could you give me an example, just so we can nail on something? A very simple sentence that expresses a very simple thought.
What about 2 + 2 = 4, as you mentioned?
Okay, so the idea is
that would be a simple proposition that can be found in logically possible minds. Even the most convoluted proposition could be found in some convoluted logically possible mind, and still they don't need each other for their existence. The fact that their existence coincides doesn't mean that there's any dependence or need from one to the other. That ontologically heavy link is what I'm wondering if we can sever.
So I used to, because the thing is that I will need to do something else, right? I mean, because then the notion won't solve my problem. If I can't pin the thought that 2 + 2 = 4, right? Where I don't mean a mental process, but this entity that we're trying to be, this objective entity that we need to limn. Or what is it? So first of all, I think if I take your suggestion, well, of course what you're saying is quite plausible, right? It's because you're saying, well, 2 + 2 = 4. There are possible minds that can think 2 + 2 = 4. That, of course, seems correct and more plausible than what I'm saying, because you haven't said anything else. So far I'm with you. The problem is that it seems to me at this point, if I don't appeal to that entity as the thought, to be the thought that 2 + 2 = 4, my thought, Pythagoras' thought, the Babylonians' thought, the Mayans, and so on, then I don't have a solution anymore. So are you saying I should then help myself to some other notion of a proposition? Or so I guess what I'm saying, I'm struggling to see how I can accept your proposal and still have it help my proposal.
Have to think more about it. Thank you.
Yeah. Do you understand? Because like you're denying the very phenomena that I'm leaning on at the end, which is that because all this stuff about accessibility, I'm not like David Lewis, right? We live in reality, that's it, right? And then all this stuff about possibility is just us describing how reality might have been. And so if I can't, and everything you're saying is consistent with that, but if I can't then help myself to the accessibility of this world to another possible world that I'm describing, in which there's a possible mind, then I lose my solution. That's the worry, I think. I mean, it's not a worry for you, it's a worry for me. Yeah.
I'm happy to live with some limited accessibility.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, for sure that the project will be for this to be a publishable, for this to be something other than a paper on church, for it to be a paper about my own view, I have to work out the stuff that you and Ricardo are pushing me for. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Following the list is Axel.
Hola, Oliver. Oh, this was great. Yeah, I think Ricardo and Raimundo are right. This has been great and very thought-provoking. Of course, I'm a Platonist, so I am all happy for Church is right. Frege was right. We all knew that propositions were cool, abstract entities, but I think it would be more helpful if I try to say something against it, right? First of all, something that can be a little more constructive for your proposal is to look into the whole debate around Hellman's structuralism. I think it's completely analogous to your problem. He tries also to use possibilia to deal with abstract entities in general, right? And there's a lot of literature around that, and it is very. So I think you are in the right way. Nevertheless, I'm going to try to defend nominalism, especially against Kripke's criticism, because I think it plays such a central part in the dialectic that it's important to be clear exactly what it establishes, and also whether it can have still a sharp edge against possibilia, against your possible propositions proposal, right? Because if we look at Scheffer's proposal, right? Scheffer's proposal seems very, 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 very close to Church, right? It's just that they are properties instead of entities, but they're still abstract in that sense, right?
Schiffer or Scheffer? Sorry, Axel. Schiffer or Scheffer?
No, not the recent one, the old one. The one that says that propositions are properties. Yeah, that one. I don't know how to.
Well, Well, he's supposed to be nominalism. Shall I just share the slide on it?
It's supposed to be a nominalism, but you have to take that properties are not abstract, right?
Something like some kind of quality or feature of an inscription that is captured by a general term.
Yes.
So that's why the funny gerrymandered apologies.
Yeah.
There we go. So Columbus asserted that the earth is round inscription.
Yeah, but you say that it's obviously implausible. Why? I mean, why is it different? I mean, the only problem is that the inscription, because it still depends on actual inscriptions, right? It has to be a property of actual inscription. But other than that, it is fine, right?
I think it's supposed to be totally concrete, right? The whole thing is supposed to be about sounds in the air and marks on paper. So it's a slightly idealized notion of inscription because it includes pronouncements or verbalizations, but they're meant to be vibrations in the air or marks on paper.
Okay, that's fine, good enough, at least for a response to Kripke's criticism. Because what Scheffler can say is that the Carnap's problem was that it just gave you a token, a concrete token, not just talked about a concrete token, but actually gives you a concrete token, and a concrete token has to be in some language, and therefore that's going to create some problems. The problems that right?
Axel, I'm sorry. I think it's the other way around. I think Carnap thinks that sentences are abstract, but he's more comfortable with sentences than with propositions. I think Scheffler thinks that these things are concrete.
No, but the problem is not the concrete abstract, is the token type distinction, right? Carnap thinks it is still about particular sentences, even if they are.
No, abstract. I'd say for Carnap, they're types. For Scheffler, they're tokens.
What?
See, Carnap
Sentences
Carnap as saying, well,
sentences are inscription types, but there are still types of sentences, right? Because the sentences types for Carnap are language dependent, right?
Yes, so they're the abstract outputs of rules.
So what we need are types that are not language dependent. right? We need to have. So the good thing about Scheffler's proposal is that these properties are not language dependent, right? So inscriptions in different language can still have the same proposition as property, right? There are some qualities to inscriptions in different languages that are captured by these properties. So if you have this, then the way that you can adapt a Carnapian solution to the problem of what Columbus believed is that you can say that Columbus had whatever attitude toward inscriptions that had this property, the property that corresponds to the proposition, the earth is round, right? So there are some sentences that Columbus understood that have this property, and these are the ones that Columbus approved of, right? And that can be, that analysis, I don't know if it has other problems, but at least that is immune to Kripke's argument, right?
So let's see. The thing about the Church Schiffer-Kripke argument is that to know what Columbus believed, one needs to know which Fragaean thought proposition he believed. One needs to know that he believed the proposition that the earth is round. Scheffler, see, the reason I've got this all hyphenated, Scheffler denies that there is any such entity that designated in a belief ascription, because he believed, and the reason that is that there are no names in this whole construction. What did Columbus assert? There are no singular terms in that entire thing I've got highlighted. Furthermore, the point is of hyphenating these is that you can't break it up into pieces so that there are then names of particular concepts.
That is good. That is great for to respond to Kripke, because if what Columbus asserted or what he believed was that the earth is round inscription, then you're not translating anything, because there is nothing in any language in that analysis. So the translation argument is immune. It is immune to the translation argument.
That's interesting. I mean, surely it is inscribed in a language, right? So. Oh yeah,
but that is. But as you said, just because we speak in languages, therefore we don't have any other way to identifying it ourselves. But just as that the earth is round are not components, the sentences are also not components, just the way we identify this property, but the property is not language dependent.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect that Scheffler would not allow that there are properties at all. So it sounds like what you're proposing is that somehow this somehow gets at a general property of inscriptions. So it's that the earth is round inscription. So it's one of many such inscriptions. So this is a general property and Columbus's inscription is one of the things that instantiates.
Exactly.
That already sounds anti-nominalist to me. So there are two things will be any problem.
Why would it be anti-nominalist?
Because it's a property. You keep saying property.
Yeah.
So that would be my worry. I mean, I wasn't trying to bring out every aspect of his nominalism. What I was just simply trying to bring out was how one might challenge the assumption about a logical form. There's a thing. See, on this analysis, there's no thing that's being referred to.
Nope.
But we're predicating some kind of entity of inscriptions. And the way so there are two issues. The issue is this entity can it serve as a meaning? And then there is also the issue of whether it's just as abstract as the things that you and I believe in and Scheffler doesn't.
Yeah, but this is not this is a property. It's not an entity, right? So it is not. I mean, even to say that it is abstract is already kind of a maybe even a category error, right? Because the only entities that are quantified over are concrete. It's Columbus and inscriptions. So from that perspective, it's still nominalist friendly. It is. I mean, yeah. I mean, of course, it also appeals to properties because, of course, any analysis is going to appeal to properties and relations. But at least these are properties of concrete objects. So that is why.
I mean, but perhaps it's not a property. Perhaps that there is just a whole bunch of inscriptions, and Columbus asserted one of them. That would sound more nominal. Yeah. But then it is tied. If there's no property, which sounds more nominalist to me, then it is tied to the inscription, and one would need to know what the inscription meant, you see, and then it would be vulnerable to the church argument.
No, that is question begging against the proposal, because what it's saying is that the analysis tells you that there are these inscriptions, and everybody that believes that the earth is round would assert at least one of them, right? And that's the analysis.
Maybe so.
And if you understand that one of those, if you understand that, there is nothing that you need, nothing extra you need to understand that somebody believes that the earth is round.
I don't know about that. I mean,
yeah, why not?
Well. Well, first, I mean, I can't infer this. Okay, this is good. I can't infer this from this because, well, I mean, you know, to be honest, Axel, it's just we would need to write out in first order logic or something exactly what Scheffler means by this thing I've got highlighted. But it's actually not, because remember, you don't just allow yourself that this hyphenated thing.
No, yeah, definitely.
Allows you to infer this, right?
This is not. Yeah, that's good. This is not, because it is not an analytic entailment. I mean, it is. I mean, there is something right in saying that in order to infer one from the other, you would need to know English, right? And but that is something that is not part of the epistemic fact about Columbus, right? So the analysis is still right. It separates the linguistic part from the mental part, right? So the reason why we cannot go from Columbus asserted that the earth is round inscription to Columbus asserted that the earth is round is because the first one is a sentence about what Columbus believed, and the second one is about how would Columbus assert this content in English. So therefore, it is good that you cannot get one from the other.
I think you're doing a very Quinean thing, which is saying, which I suspect that nominalists used to do something like this, right? Which is to say, well, there's a problem with this, right? There's something that philosophers are bothered about. We have to posit this cognitive relation to a proposition that we don't understand. And so rather than giving an analysis of it in terms of this, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to replace it with this. And if I replace it with this, then somehow as a Quinean or a nominalist, I feel better about my new regimented language and I can go on to something else. But to me, the problem with this kind of strategy is that it just diverts attention from the original question, the original problem. Still, if this isn't, which is, I'm now stating the version of the paradox of analysis, right? If this isn't an analysis of this, then, well, I just don't, I mean, its truth becomes almost irrelevant, right? The original problem was this, not something else which has no logical relation to it.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I think we already. I mean, I can try to respond, but I don't know if there are many other people that have raised their hand. Yeah, Bram. Okay, we can return later. I think we've taken.
Thanks.
Following is Abraham.
Thank you, Oliver. Nice seeing you. I wanted to ask you about the role of mind, and the last thing you mentioned, playing a role in making this thing. And I'm just basically trying to understand better what's the role of possible minds in your view. So in the argument that you gave at the beginning, you said that some things are true even if no one has ever thought of them. But I'm not so sure why you need the thought for them to be true, or if the thought is playing an important role for them being true or not, because they can be true even if they're not thought by anyone. But nonetheless, it seems to be important that there's some kind of like mind or thought or subject that it's making the inference of correspondence between the statements or the thoughts and the facts. So I'm just trying to understand how the view works, and I don't know if it's a fair analogy, but I'm trying to think of the tree that falls and no one hears it, no? Things like that. Like, what kind of sound does it make? Does it make any sound? And it seems to me that the moment you put a mind there, it kind of makes sense that it makes a noise. If you don't have minds, not so clear, no? Because what you're comparing with, like, what kind of the two things that you're making the correspondence with. So I'm trying to understand if to make the correspondence between those two things, you need minds or not.
Yeah, so I think on the abstract view of propositions that Church is arguing for, you don't, right? I just think that it turns out that for us to have a true theory of language or logic, we need propositions for the reasons he's argued for. Given that we need propositions, they exist. That was a little bit of the argument I skated over. He has a criterion of existence, says, if you're the true theory we ultimately converge on, right, after all this argument is done, hundreds of years, right? If that theory entails propositions, then there are propositions. And then finally, I think the nature of abstract propositions in the abstract sense are mind independent. So, and given the argument that I gave. Now, so are they independent of possible minds?
Yeah, maybe that's the question. If they're independent, if they're mind independent, why do you need possible minds?
Yeah.
Why is there some need of establishing the possibility of minds to make it work?
Yes, right. Well, or alternatively, maybe another way of putting it would be, if everyone needs possible minds, then my theory is just a proposition theory, right? That would be another way of putting your objection. So if Church's propositions and Fraga's propositions, if the third realm, as Frege, Church did not endorse this way of speaking. He was a much more moderate realist than Frege, but just to be vivid, right? Frege had this weird metaphor that they exist in a realm, right? There's obviously very Platonist as philosophers read, certain philosophers read Plato. Right? So if those things need possible minds, then my theory just is another version of that theory. That would be another objection. Or I don't know if it's an objection, but that would be another question. Yeah.
Maybe I can think of the way of putting it, like the tree that falls and no one hears it. Is there the need of possible minds for it to make a sound, or?
Well, that depends on that. Then I have to have the metaphysics of sounds, right? So, I mean,
yeah. Well, that makes me. Well, maybe this is related to what Ricardo had in mind. But I was thinking if the truth of certain propositions are more mind dependent than others, and it seems to me like the one that implies sound or perception kind of like depend more on a possible mind, whereas maybe, I'm not so sure, some mathematical truths are less likely to like pull that intuition to make us think that there needs to be true. Some kind of and maybe that's also the difference. Also, so when you were saying about Columbus thinking that the world is round, it looks more like the tree falling and no one hearing it, right? Because it seems like what makes it true, it's some kind of like perception of it being round, not just a calculation or like, it is not so obvious that it can be inferred a priori.
Yeah, so let me just mention one. Okay, so the basic idea is we're going to classify families of propositions depending on the kind of intentional attributes that make them up. You know, some of them are about numbers, some of them are about primary qualities, secondary qualities. So I need to divide this into like a sort of space of different things to say about different propositions depending on the entities that occur in them, right? That's certainly right. So that seems to be one thing you're saying. Let me just, so I sound like always like to point this out to people. Because what you're saying also applies to so let's take fictional entities. So what I'm arguing here, right, is that abstractness is a negative doctrine, right? And we infer the abstractness of the 2 and 2 are 4 from the fact that these claims are all nonsensical and false. And from that abstractness, we then infer their mind independence, right, in particular, if this is false. Notice that if you replace 2 and 2 are 4 with Sherlock Holmes is a more famous detective than Watson, right? Things become different, right? Like it's not so clear that. So if I say Sherlock Holmes is a famous detective would be false if there were no human minds. I mean, that doesn't strike me as nonsense at all, right? So there's something else going on here. In addition, which may be an instance of what you're saying, which is that there are degrees of abstractness among the abstract objects. Mm-hmm. So the fact that if I replace Sherlock Holmes is famous, if I substitute Sherlock Holmes is famous for 2 + 2 = 4, this sentence goes from nonsensical to sensible, shows that Sherlock Holmes is less abstract and less objective than 2 and 4. So this may be a way of bringing out or helping sharpen what you're saying, right? Is that there are, so I believe that it's arguable that Sherlock Holmes is abstract, but he's a particular kind of abstract object that depends for his existence on human practices, right? And that's why it's sensible to say that Sherlock Holmes would be famous. Sherlock Holmes would not be. It is false that Sherlock Holmes would be famous if there were no minds. That makes sense, right? And it's because he's a particular kind of abstract object that depends on human activity in a way that numbers do not by those criteria, right? Mm-hmm. So that's another example. What I need to do is I need to pick propositions instead of examples of different families of propositions. So let's I picked the most helpful one to make my point vivid, right? Because it was about numbers. But then there are ones about primary qualities, ones about secondary qualities. You seem to be assuming that sound is partly a secondary quality, right?
Yeah.
Fictional entities. What I need to do is divide this into a space, this space into like a bunch of subspaces and see how they all behave. So that's good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marshall. Thank you, Oliver. Thanks.
Ricardo Mina.
Yeah, I guess I have time for a follow-up. So I'm still, it feels strange to me still to claim that there is a thought that exists in this world, even if the mind that is thinking that thought only exists in an accessible world. But I was thinking, I mean, if you're gonna rely that heavily on possible minds, why don't just claim that, yes, thoughts are mind dependent and that these thoughts only exist in that other possible world? So the idea is, look, there's this complex mathematical theorem that no one on earth has ever thought about, but it's true. And you need an account of why that's true. Well, there's this mind in an accessible world who has thought about the theorem and has proved it, or whether it's proven or not, I don't think it's important, but that mind has the relevant thought and the thought is true. So why would you need that thought to exist in this world? Why don't you just keep the thought in the world where that mind is having that thought? Or think about a contingent truth that something that is true in this world, but no one has ever thought about it in this world. Well, for sure, there's an accessible world and there's a mind in that world who has thought about that contingent thing, and that thought is true. And that thought only exists in that other world. And why is it true in this world? Well, because that thought that mind is having in that other world is about this world, and the thought is true. So, I mean, again, the point is, if you're going to rely so heavily on possible minds, I don't see why you still need to claim that thoughts are mind independent. Why don't you claim that they are mind dependent? They stay in the worlds where the minds that are having those thoughts are, and just like, claim everything else you need to claim about truth and whatnot.
Maybe, I don't know. I'll have to break out a pen and paper and see if that can do what I wanted to do. I mean, the key thing is that that they have to display the sort of, they have to behave well under those sort of tests for objectivity that I was just showing Abraham, right? So I want to get the common sense results about mind independence. If I can do that and do everything else I want, then I might concede what you're saying. I have to figure this out. So I don't know if I'm happy or sad that I added this on this morning right before I gave the talk, because so far all the questions have been about that and not about Church's argument for proposition. So, I mean, look, one thing I would say is this, right? They cannot depend on actual minds, right? They have to depend on the idea of mind or something more abstract, right? This is a picture of science on which we start with a bunch of possibilities. There are the things that happen to have been instantiated here. And there are all the other things that run. Of course, it's a noble and very difficult task to understand the actual mental processes and actual spoken languages in the actual world, right? But there's also this much, much bigger task of all the science and philosophy we could sort of reverse engineer. Right? We theorize, discover the possibilities first, and then by various kinds of tests and arguments and implementation, we try and figure out if we can instantiate them or not, or if they're really possible, right? So that's the picture I'm working with, and in which case philosophy of mind should be about mind, not about actual human and animal mental processing, which is of course a part of it, a very important part, but It's a tiny fraction of it. So that's the basic thought. Exactly how the metaphysics works out, I have to think more about, right? Because really, this was just a way of. So what I was trying to say, the very church argues very powerfully, right? That to understand Columbus believed that the Earth is round, you need to posit a relation between Columbus and a proposition that is unmediated by language. If you say Columbus believed the meaning of P, you face this further question, well, what does P mean, right? And that means that you haven't given an analysis. But this, okay, it sounds okay if you say, well, then, so in the analysis, we need to just name this direct relation between Columbus and the proposition that the Earth is round. Okay, again, all fine. But now, what is this relation? This is like a terrible weak point in neo-Russellian propositions theorizing. When we left Frege behind, we gave up the resources of understanding, right? Because, a sense is something it attaches to language and you understand it. You can see that although Church is the arch Fregean, in this case, he said that it seems to me that there's a primitive relationship between human beings and senses that is a part of the analysis of belief. And if you don't agree with that, well, then just look at my argument. If you make the relation between humans and senses or propositions mediated, then your analysis goes false or irrelevant or something. And it's just, so my thought was that there's something very unsatisfying about philosophers positing primitive relations to things. So, people get upset about mathematical intuition, and I used to be upset about mathematical intuition. And then one day I was just talking to a logician who I've spoken to for years, and at some point he just told me what mathematical intuition was. In other terms, it was not naturalist or reductionist, but he just suddenly said what it was in terms of things that I know we can already do, right? Even if it's not a biological reduction or something, he just redescribed it as a capacity that I know that human beings have. And at that point, I stopped being worried about what mathematical intuition is. So I'm looking for something similar with the grasping of a proposition, right? I don't want to necessarily reduce it to, I don't want to reduce it to the physical, the biological, but I just want some illumination, right? And the Soames-Burge thing, in which propositions are sort of more Aristotelian, they're abstracted from actual mental activity. This does seem more tractable, right? Because it replaces the metaphor of grasping with a metaphor of instantiation, right? So Burge has this wonderful passage. He says, what is it to grasp a thought? You think it. And at that point, if I can get a theory like that, then I've immediately reduced something mysterious to grasping a acquaintance with a proposition, acquaintance with this meaning, sentence-sized abstract entity, with the thinking of a sentence-sized thought. And at that point, I'm satisfied because no cognitive scientist or reductionist or follower of, Stephen Stitch is going to tell me that we don't think, right? So at that point, I'm satisfied. And the Burge-Soames theory offers some progress in that direction. But then I want to make sure that the Burge-Soames theory doesn't have propositions as mind-dependent, right? And if I've got all that, then I'm happy and I'm willing to live with different kinds of metaphysics. But you're absolutely right that I do need to spell this out. Does that make sense? So that's sort of the project in a nutshell, right? I think Church's arguments are very, very promising, but they just leave you with this mystery. Like you have to posit like a Russellian acquaintance relation between a person and an abstract object for language to be possible at all, right? I mean, think of attributions of natural language understanding. Ricardo knows that S means the P. That's a doubly embedded propositional attitude attribution, right? It's like, it's going to have to appeal to a relation to a thought or a meaning. And I don't want everything to hang on some, however impressive the arguments are for it. If you're left with a primitive cognitive relation between a person and a meaning, then I want to hear something more as a philosopher. There's an itch that I want to scratch. And this is just currently the way I'm going about it, basically. So that's the whole project in a nutshell, in answer to your question, but you're nevertheless raising very good technical objections that I need to say, we'll have to say more about.
There are no more questions, but we have some...
Does anyone have a question about Church's argument for the existence of propositions?
I think that we can back to Axel's concern, and there are 6 minutes.
Okay.
Axel?
And to continue back to it's only 5 minutes left.
Okay.
Also, whether people want to hear Axel and I argue about a view that neither of us believes is maybe stretching people's
patience.
So I think that we have finished.
Okay, so that was great feedback. As always, thank you very much for your attention and for the opportunity to be here, even though we're in these strange, virally constrained circumstances. I'm very happy in my little home Mexican house that you can see here. And I'm very happy to be at the Institute, interacting with people, even if only or remotely. So thank you very much. And I'd love to hear from anyone who I haven't met or emailed with as well.
Adios, creo.
And thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Ricardo. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.